Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So today I'm using my newly acquired ring light so you can see my whole face without shadows. That's kind of nice. And today what I wanted to talk about was to follow up on an episode that I made a few weeks ago where I talked about the success of China's dynamic zero COVID policy that's kept deaths extremely low compared to the West. So, for example, let's have a look at. Oops, wrong one. There we go. So as you can see, up until uh, November of last year, China had an incredibly low death rate, and as far as we know, that still continued. But in any case, China finally decided to drop its dynamic zero COVID policy. And right after I made that video complimenting China on its dynamic zero COVID policy, meaning they adjust the policy to keep cases low, but it's not a static policy. Right after I made that video, China dropped its zero COVID policy, and instead they say that their goal is to keep severe illnesses low, and they're not so much worried about infections anymore. So, what have they done? Well, there's no more mass testing of entire cities' populations, millions and millions of tests, as you had during outbreaks in China before. You generally don't have to show a green code on a phone application indicating a negative test to go to places anymore. At least that's generally the case. I don't know if they're using it in specific circumstances. There are no more lockdowns at this point. There's no quarantine upon entering the country, although a negative test is still required, and so on. At the same time, wearing masks is still mandated in public indoor spaces. Excuse me. People are still required to quarantine if they're sick, although typically that's at home now, etc. So China certainly hasn't gone to the extreme of the sort of vaccine-only COVID mitigation policy that most of the rest of the world has adopted, where basically they don't seem to care how many people get infected. Nonetheless, the changes that China has made have resulted in China going from having hardly any COVID infections most of the time to having countless millions of infections, perhaps hundreds of millions. And China has a population of 1.4 billion, so it's likely still the minority of the population that has gotten infected, but millions and millions of infections within the space of just a month. So, was this the right decision? In a video that my friend who lives in China, Jerry Gray, made recently, he said he thought it was, that China had picked the right time to open up. So here's what he said. Gonna switch the source here. I just discovered this handy feature of clipping YouTube videos right after I started talking to Jerry. But anyway, here's the clip.
The second one is China opened too soon, but it didn't. Experts complained loud and long that China needed to open as it was affecting the economy and people's livelihoods. China waited until the right time to open, and they opened. Remember when they didn't open? There was criticism. Now they have opened, there's criticism. They could never have won that particular debate.
Okay, well, he certainly makes an excellent point at the end that there's no way China can win, regardless of what they do, even if they switch from one extreme to the other. Which, I mean, they didn't do that here, but they switched. They made a very dramatic change in policy, and zero COVID was criticized by the West, and China's current policy is seeking to contain severe illness, but not necessarily the same stringency in terms of containing infections. They get criticized for that too, and there are these claims that, oh, China's going to have millions of deaths now, but there's no reason to think that's going to be the case because, as I said, there's still almost everybody's still wearing masks. People are still staying home if they're sick. There's still a lot of testing, and China has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, and they're making a concerted effort to provide boosters to vulnerable populations such as the elderly, and just in general encouraging that. But in any case, Jerry said, as many people in China have said, both foreigners living there and residents, that this was a good decision to open up, and this was the right time to do it. Now, although it may have been a good time to make some changes, I guess I have to politely disagree with the view that the particular decision they made were they basically jettisoned most of their infection prevention measures, other than the ones I mentioned, almost all at once. I don't think that was the right decision. Now, before I explain why I disagree with the decision, maybe I should discuss with you why you should consider my opinion seriously, even though I'm not a doctor and I'm not a trained public health expert or virologist or anything like that. And obviously, as Chinese public health experts, scientists and so forth with relevant expertise who made this decision. My expertise is in psychology. I'm a social psychologist. But during the last 3 years, my colleague Bob Sinclair and I have conducted a lot of research on the COVID pandemic. And what we've looked at has been how culture and ideology have influenced responses to the COVID pandemic, both on a governmental level and on an individual level. And this isn't the place for me to go into detail about that research, but suffice it to say that one of our important findings has been that collectivist or group-oriented cultures such as China have done a much better job of containing the COVID pandemic than individualistic cultures such as the United States, where I'm from, or Canada, where Bob is from. And that's been particularly true for countries with socialist governments, again, such as China. Group-oriented cultures have been better about tracking the spread of the virus through testing and contact tracing. They've had a much higher rate of mask wearing, and we're more likely to mandate that people wear masks in situations where COVID spread was likely. They've been more likely to implement measures to contain the spread of COVID, such as lockdowns, and to do so in a much more timely manner than individualistic cultures. So I think I've given this example before. The UK in January of 2021 implemented a very strict, although not as strict as the ones that have been implemented in Wuhan, for example, lockdown that lasted from January until early May, and it was nationwide, whereas, as you probably know, China has never had a nationwide lockdown. And they did succeed in containing the spread of COVID. Their rates of cases and deaths were close to zero by the time they lifted the lockdowns, but they waited too late. So there were massive numbers of people dying throughout January in the UK. That didn't happen in China. And you can go down the list. There are lots and lots of countries in the West that locked down in 2020, sometimes in 2021, but mainly in 2020, and succeeded in containing the spread of COVID. But they implemented their lockdowns too late, and in many cases they lifted them too early. So they didn't truly contain COVID. Anyway, in the course of doing our research, Bob and I have learned a lot about statistics on COVID infections and deaths in different countries and the factors that influence the impact that the pandemic has, such as masks and vaccinations, and ventilation and air filtration, and testing and contact tracing, quarantines and lockdowns, and so forth. So at the very least, I'm a quite educated layperson about this issue of how to contain the adverse consequences of an infectious disease epidemic. So anyway, my observation of what's been stated in Chinese news media and on social media among people living in China is that people generally don't perceive the Omicron variant of COVID that spread throughout the world in December through last winter of 2021-22. People in China tend not to perceive Omicron as being very much of a threat. And I think that now that the country has achieved a high vaccination rate and the vast majority of people still wear masks and stay home when they're sick and so forth, that the impact of abandoning zero COVID in terms of the amount of severe illness will be minimal. And that basically the primary outcome of giving up zero COVID will be life going, quote, back to normal. I've even seen some foreigners living in China saying things to the effect that Omicron is mild, like a cold. Now, I can state unequivocally, based on closely following the outbreak over the past year or so, since Omicron came onto the scene, that it's simply wrong to say that Omicron is mild. So in the U.S., where I live, more than 260,000 people lost their lives to COVID last year. And the overwhelming majority of those people were infected with the Omicron variant. Delta existed in January. Some of the people in the hospital in January last year had Delta, but very few. Most were Omicron, and it proceeded to take over. And there are lots of other countries, such as Canada and Japan and South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and as many of you know, the Chinese province of Hong Kong, which is governed independently from the mainland. These countries and Hong Kong all have very, very bad outbreaks of Omicron and had large numbers of severe illnesses and deaths as a result of this or that subvariant of the Omicron variant, particularly last winter, but since then as well. Hong Kong had an outbreak in the spring that was one of the worst COVID outbreaks of the entire pandemic, where huge numbers of people were dying. A lot of that has to do with a poor vaccination rate among their elderly population. But anyway, note that all of the countries that I just mentioned above, except for the U.S., have very high vaccination rates. So Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand all above 80%. Hong Kong is now, not a country, but, anyway, Hong Kong, like the mainland of China, has a vaccination rate of over 90% now, but that wasn't the case last spring. Even the U.S. has a very high vaccination rate among its elderly, and yet vaccination alone didn't suffice to stop Omicron from killing large numbers of people, even though death rates are far higher among the unvaccinated than among vaccinated people. So just to give you a quick idea about that, let's take a look at some stats. So here's data from the U.S. About a year ago, comparing death rates per 100,000 people for unvaccinated people, fully vaccinated people, that is 2 shots, but no booster, and fully vaccinated plus a booster, and you can see just uh, humongous differences. They're just massive differences as a function of vaccination. So vaccination definitely works. Um, uh, I think a lot of the optimism that I've seen expressed within China about the likely impact of opening up on severe illness is based on the observation of the outbreak in the city of Guangzhou. Uh, Sorry if my pronunciation is terrible. During the fall. Basically, it's been claimed that there were about 180,000 COVID infections in Guangzhou during its outbreak, and there were no deaths. So, makes it sound like COVID is mild, Omicron is mild, right? Now, well, may well be that there were no deaths during this outbreak, but it seems to be very much an anomaly for a city, state, or country where you have a massive outbreak of the Omicron variant of COVID. As I just talked about, with those massive outbreaks causing huge numbers of deaths uh, in various countries. And at the same time, there's some evidence that acute illness from Omicron is not typically as severe as for some of the previous variants, such as the Delta variant. But, you know, part of the difference has to do with there being a higher rate of vaccination now, and also part of the difference has to, not in China so much, but in other countries, it had to do with a lot of people having immunity resulting from previous infection. Now, it's kind of a mixed bag what getting infected with COVID does to your immunity. For a lot of people, there's a boost in their immune response the next time they're exposed to COVID, but that may not happen. And in fact, for some people, the second time they get infected with COVID, it can be worse. One thing that caught my eye in discussions of this outbreak in China, or excuse me, specifically the Guangzhou outbreak, is that it was said that about 90% of the infections were asymptomatic. Now, if you ask me, if you have an asymptomatic infection with a SARS-CoV-2 virus, you don't have COVID. You have, a COVID infection. In any case, it does 90% being asymptomatic who test positive necessarily mean that we're looking at a mild variant of COVID here? I don't think so. For one thing, a significant majority of infections with previous variants have also been mild or asymptomatic. I think, if I remember correctly, about half were asymptomatic with the original variant, and the majority of the rest were, had mild cases, meaning they didn't have to be hospitalized. And one thing in particular to note about Guangzhou and about other cities in China that have had outbreaks too, is that the city pulled out all the stops to minimize the number of COVID infections. So there was a lockdown. More than half of the residents were given PCR tests for COVID, which are very sensitive. If you have a COVID infection, they'll pick it up, whereas a rapid test often has a lot of false negatives. So it's likely that almost all of the COVID infections in the city were detected, and that detection occurred in a very timely manner. Now, that's definitely not typical of how locales around the world have responded to COVID outbreaks. Many cases get missed, or they're not caught early enough to ward off severe illness, if the person is susceptible to severe illness. Now, I don't know enough about that outbreak in Guangzhou to say for sure why there were so few severe illnesses, but those are some plausible explanations. But at any rate, it seems questionable to assume that just because the outbreak in Guangzhou was so well contained that there were no deaths. I keep changing my pronunciation, hoping that at least one of them will be close to right. Anyway, it was so well contained that apparently there were no deaths. Does that mean that COVID has suddenly become milder than in the past? I don't think so. Um, for one thing, we're probably looking at 1/10 that number of positive tests who actually had symptomatic COVID. So that's 18,000 rather than 180,000. Vastly less than the number of people who have been infected in places that haven't gone to such great lengths to try to contain COVID, to contain Omicron. Even within China, the experience of places that have had significant outbreaks of Omicron has not been that nobody died. So at the beginning of 2022, official statistics indicated that there had been about 4,600 deaths from COVID in China since late 2019. The overwhelming majority of those, of course, were in Wuhan, where the virus was novel. It took people by surprise. But during 2022, when Omicron has been the prevalent variant, there have been another 613 deaths out of 333,389 confirmed cases. So that works out to a case fatality rate of 0.18%. So 18 people out of 1,000 dying. Wait, is my math right there? Hold on. Excuse me, 2 out of 1,000. Sorry. Anyway, that's not much, right? That's a pretty low fatality rate. But imagine that instead of 333,000 cases, you have 333 million. And that seems like a pretty plausible estimate for this winter outbreak, based on estimates that have been given by Chinese public health officials. And at the case fatality rate for 2022, that would be 613,000 deaths instead of 613. So just to mention one of these estimates that I was referring to, Wu Zhenyu, the chief epidemiologist at the Chinese Centers for Disease Control, estimated that around 10 to 30% of the Chinese population, or approximately 140 to 420 million people, would be infected with COVID this winter, and that between 0.09 and 0.16% of those infected would die. So this puts the estimated number of deaths, according to Wu, at between 126,000 and 672,000. And I have to wonder, what exactly is there to be gained here that is worth the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives? And it's not just death that's the issue here, but suffering. Millions of people are going to wind up being seriously ill and having to spend time in the hospital. Millions more people will have lingering effects of the virus, so-called long COVID, where inflammation and various other sometimes persistent outcomes of COVID can cause a wide assortment of very unpleasant and potentially disabling symptoms for months or perhaps years or perhaps indefinitely. So, taking the example of the United States, we have approximately a fourth of the population of China, 330 some odd million people, and at any given time, 2 to 4 million people are too disabled as a result of having long COVID to work. So I hope that Dr. Wu's estimate is incorrect, but I worry that it may not be. And granted, there are economic benefits to things like not locking down anymore, not having quarantines when you come into the country, and so forth and so on. Undoubtedly, that will likely help China's economy, assuming that there isn't an outbreak that puts a lot of people in a position where they're not able to work. Okay, so that's the benefit, but is that worth sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives? I don't think the majority of China's people would consider losing hundreds of thousands of lives to be any more acceptable than I do. I don't consider that an acceptable outcome. Now, one common misconception that a lot of people have about COVID is that since the vast majority of people who die from it are older, COVID isn't having much of an impact on overall deaths because most of the people who die from it would have died from something else soon anyway. And that turns out not to be true, but let's explore that a bit. That was the view of one of the people commenting on Jerry's video that I showed you a clip from previously. So let's take a look at what he said and how I responded to him. Okay, somebody named Kevin Lai said China has 1 million deaths in 2000, or he meant 10 million deaths in 2019 before the pandemic. 10 million deaths in any, in a typical year. That's about 27,400 deaths per day. That number will increase every year since there are more and more aged people in China. I think the estimated 130,000 to 690,000 deaths. I gave a different estimate because I used the exact population of China according to Worldometer. But anyway, I think the estimated 130,000 to 690,000 deaths are not the extra deaths on top of the 1 million, 10 million deaths. Some of the old guys are close to the end point, and COVID is the last straw. So, what I said was about 20% of U.S. COVID deaths in 2020 were people under 65. And, that's pretty similar for 2021 and 2022. So obviously, those people are losing a lot of years off their life expectancy. Given that life expectancy up until the COVID pandemic in the U.S. was about 78. And incidentally, that's what the life expectancy is up to now in China, whereas the U.S. has declined to 76. So, if you're, say, 40 years old and you die of COVID, that's 38 years off of your life expectancy. But even for older people, they aren't that likely to die in a given year otherwise. If someone has managed to make it to 80 years old without developing a terminal illness, their life expectancy is about 90 rather than 78. Obviously, their life expectancy isn't 78 because they're already 80. So, in fact, there are a lot of older people who would lose a lot of years of life if they were to die from COVID. And in fact, a U.S. study found that the estimated average number of years of life lost by people who had died of COVID in 2020 was 14 years. And let's see, where's the link to that study? Okay, I don't have it. I'm sorry. I don't really feel like taking the time to look for it. Let's see. One thing I do want to show you, though. Just to make this concrete, younger people do, in fact, die of COVID. So, this young lady, Fatima Shah Hussein, was only 29 years old and died of complications from long COVID, where you have persistent symptoms for more than a month or two after you have had COVID. And those deaths actually aren't counted in official COVID statistics because generally you have to have died within about a month of testing positive for COVID to be counted as a COVID death. But there are millions and millions of people who have these long COVID symptoms where they get blood clots and fatigue and brain dysfunction and many, many other possible symptoms. And it can kill you. It certainly puts you at more risk of early death. So just to give you a few stats here, as I said, the U.S.'s life expectancy has fallen during the COVID pandemic. The U.S. has lost 2.7 years, last I heard, in life expectancy over the course of the pandemic. Over 200,000 American kids have lost a parent or sometimes both parents to COVID. We have millions of people who've been hospitalized, millions who've been disabled by long COVID or seriously ill from COVID, as well as officially more than 1.1 million deaths. So, China, trust me, you don't want to go our route or even close to it. Now, while I doubt that China is going to go back to zero COVID, I hope and I believe, based on what I know of the Chinese government and its accomplishments over the recent years, eliminating extreme poverty and massive development of renewable energy and high-speed rail, and of course zero COVID. So I think that the government's going to keep trying to contain COVID, even though it's not pursuing zero COVID. So I hope that we're not going to see a situation where hundreds of thousands or perhaps more than a million lives are needlessly lost. Because it isn't plausible to me, based on what I know, that the Chinese government, having gone 3 years protecting people so carefully by any means necessary, would suddenly let it rip without making further adjustments in policy if they see that things are starting to slip out of control. And I think that claims to the contrary, that, oh my gosh, China's going to have millions of deaths, that's just propaganda. Just as the opposite claims that the Western media was making until recently, that zero COVID was this nightmarish authoritarian policy that was wrecking China's economy and had no real benefits. That was also propaganda. Because zero COVID saved millions of lives. Saved many more millions from severe illness or long COVID. And it actually helped China avoid tanking its economy the way Western nations did with their too little, too late COVID mitigation policies. In fact, I believe China's was the only economy that grew in 2020. But, it's important to recognize that the situation right now appears to be kind of scary from what I've seen. So have a look at this segment from the English edition of Shanghai Daily, one of China's leading news sites.
不管是阳的还是不阳的，我们已经不管了。
子全部已经塞满了，
挂到666号。
目前的这个医疗资源的这样的紧张，其实目前是第一次。
帮我看一下32条水管的，人不好了。32条水管的，家里还有人来看吗？还有人要来看吗？抢救车推过来，对吧？别吵架了，这一波高峰人蛮多的，急诊复班来就诊，每天都1700-1800左右。
主要是内科病人，内科可能占到2/3以上。看昨天好像是1400多，今天早班更多，今天已经破纪录了。今天早上我看了一下，他们已经挂号挂到1100多号了，内科已经挂到毛1000号了，比前2天还要再厉害。最主要危重病人太多了，以前可能救护车来那么多，不一定每个人都重嘛，现在来的病人都很重，然后都需要氧气监护，但问题就是说位子全部已经塞满了。我们反正所有的人都在搞，因为阳过的人都阳康了嘛，我们基本上都快阳完了应该，然后大家都基本上回来上班了。还有人就是说发烧了，但当天轮到他顶岗的，那么他们基本上就是说当天那一段班上完之后才休息啊，然后等自己烧退了之后就继续回来上班。很多人就是说带病上班呀，症状稍微缓解一点都来上班了，因为实在没有人上班嘛。我们科的同事都很团结的。
来，跟我过来来。我们把人带过这边来，完了再看一下，就是有那个号，他们不知道这边，然后我们再给他带过来。这个就是属于我们第2个急诊室吧。那边忙不过来，放到这边。那个那边属实看不过来了，完了叫多少，一回叫10个号到这边看，看完这10个，完我们再叫10个。我们就是保安，能干啥？你后边扶着点，你扭一下，你要扭这儿呢，你要扭这儿，你不扭这儿那嘎达不就摔了吗？咱们嘛都互相理解，穿个地上，有坐一下啊，都排好队，不要乱。
就跟急诊预检差不多，只不过我们这边是专门接救护车的。帮病人分流掉，然后该看外科的看外科，看内科的看内科。
他们有些自己买了那个养老服的器，在家里面测，测的稍微低一点，开始紧张，然后会说要来看。这边预检很多都是这样的。
好的，没事。
每天基本上都不带停的。像我今天周末值班的话，白天就是要收治病人，然后晚上的话还要负责下面的一些就是抢救室的一些救治啊、会诊啊。夜班的时候，可能下面医生压力也特别大，有时候下去帮忙的。现在困难的话，主要还是那个病人的病情比较重，然后医疗资源比较紧张的。目前医院其实也派了很多人来支援了。支援的话，其实现在相对来说的话，还是肯定够还是不够的，但是总归比之前确实要相对充裕一些。
把病人拉到外面去，不要再进来了。慢点，快点，我要抢到没有地方放了。慢一点啊！
这个人是一个心梗的病人，然后突然发生了一个呼吸心脏骤停，然后我们医生，然后包括我们的护士，然后立即给予患者的一个心外按压，然后这个人就是心外按压，然后心跳恢复过来了。后来又发生一个室颤，我们给予了一个电除颤。然后后面就这个人是立即收到一个导管室，是这样子的，然后这个流程也是比较紧急的。其实上我们现在已经对新冠这个说，不管是阳的还是不阳的，我们已经不管了，我们主要就是在对于病人的一个症状来进行一个治疗。现在反正来的话，基本上都是一个中老年人，然后伴基础疾病比较多的一个病人，然后还有一个就是来的都是需要一个吸氧的，都是低氧饱和，所以说现在氧源这个情况是需求量是特别大的。我们氧源的话已经不够了，然后现在就是利用他们的氧气袋，然后进行临时的一个补氧，给他临时吸一个氧气。反正基本1年365天就是这样子，24小时都不歇业的。其实对我们来说，节假日对我们已经没有什么差别了。
不存在抗原这个，不在抗原，祝大家身体健康，少来医院。
2022年能够过去的话，其实还是挺盼望2023年的，能够新的一年有新的开始吧。
来的也是病人，其实包括我们的医生护士也都是带病上岗的，大家相互理解，相互尊重。
Okay, so thousands and thousands of people in intensive care just in Shanghai alone. And I don't know what the exact figure is for the percentage of people who die from COVID, given that they're already in intensive care. 10%, 20%, I'm not sure. But definitely a lot of people. So, this doesn't look good right now. By the way, you saw the clock in the video ticking toward midnight. That was New Year's Eve, which obviously those doctors and nurses didn't get to celebrate. And that was at the peak of Shanghai's rate of COVID infections, and perhaps of, well, it was at a peak probably of their rate of hospitalizations from what I've been reading. So Shanghai is on the downward path of this outbreak. More rural areas or smaller cities in China are still in the thick of things. But looking at things like this, it's not isolated to Shanghai or that one hospital. This is happening throughout China. So that suggests this is a pretty serious matter, that quite a few people are going to die or be seriously ill, or they already are seriously ill. So I think that perhaps some reconsideration of these rapid changes is in order. So can China achieve containment of COVID infections, which, to be honest, you can't only say you're going to focus on containing severe illness and not try your darndest to contain infections, because the more infections you have, the more severe illness you're going to have. It's just the math of it. So the question is, can China achieve keeping COVID infections at a reasonably low level without returning to the era of lockdowns? Now, one thing I should make clear is that there seems to be this impression that I've seen from Chinese media and people who live in China commenting about the situation, that once this wave is over, that things will be quote unquote back to normal. And I think a word of caution is in order regarding that, because in other countries that had their big waves of Omicron earlier, things have not gone back to normal. You have varying rates of infection around the globe, and overall, the number of COVID infections has declined significantly since the peak of the first Omicron wave in most countries last winter. But we still have about 300 people a day dying of COVID here in the United States, and nobody knows how many infections we have, because most people test at home and don't report it to the government, or perhaps some of them don't test. But we're not back to normal. There's still a high rate of COVID infections here in the United States, and in many other parts of the world. So if we truly want to go back to normal, we've got to not just reduce the number of severe deaths, reduce the number of severe illnesses and reduce deaths, but we've got to contain the pandemic, keep COVID cases at a very low level all over the world. And I do think that there's reason to believe that China can sustainably have a very low rate of COVID cases without resorting to lockdowns or other measures that adversely affect the economy. And again, to be honest, my training is not as a public health expert, but I do listen to people who are public health experts. And here's what they say. about the most important things we can do to control COVID infections and the severity of disease in people who are infected. One of the most important things, and possibly the most important thing, is wearing a good mask when you go out in public, particularly in indoor settings. So good means an N95 or better mask, or perhaps a KN95. I'm not sure what the Chinese equivalent of an N95 mask is, but my understanding is that the norm for high-quality masks in China is what's called a KN95, which is not as good as an N95, but far better than a surgical or cloth mask. The point is that a high-quality mask is really important. So, a surgical mask, for example, which is what still to this day most healthcare professionals in the United States wear, is not good enough, even though it's certainly better than no mask at all. So, to give you an idea of how much a good mask helps, a recent study, which I'll put a link to it in the video description, found that under the circumstances where a non-infected person is exposed to an infected person for about half an hour, when both people are wearing N95 masks, the rate of infection is estimated to be about 1,000 times lower than if neither party is wearing a mask, where it's not quite but almost certain that you're going to get infected with COVID if you're in a room unmasked with an unmasked infected person for half an hour. Of course, another important part of alleviating the negative impact of COVID is getting vaccinated. But, especially in this era of Omicron, which is just, one of the most contagious viruses that humanity has ever known, vaccination alone doesn't provide anywhere near sufficient protection against infection, even though it provides considerable protection against severe disease, particularly if you get a booster shot. And the Chinese government is working very hard to get the rate of boosters, particularly in vulnerable populations such as the elderly, up, and that's good to see. Now, one thing that's been surprising for me to really not see any mention of in any of the Chinese media that I've looked at is perhaps the most promising way to prevent infections altogether other than masks, and that's improving ventilation and air filtration in indoor spaces. Now, of course, improving the ventilation system of an entire building, as opposed to just opening windows, which, of course, isn't practical in the winter most places, that's expensive. So, what's going to be needed is government investment in improving building ventilation, which will cost a lot of money, but it'll have a big payoff in the long run in terms of reduced incidence of not only COVID, but any other airborne infectious disease. So think about it like this. Back in the day when infectious diseases were the main killers of human beings, a lot of the problem was you had dirty, unsanitary water. So when we invested the money in improving water filtration, there was a big payoff in terms of reduced incidence of waterborne diseases. So we needed to do the same thing with indoor air and clean it up. Much cheaper than improving the whole ventilation system of a building is simply putting air filters in place in indoor spaces. And that's also very effective. So recently I purchased a HEPA, which stands for High Efficiency Particulate Absorbing Air Filter, for about $90 US. My girlfriend had been complaining of bad headaches lately. There appears to be some mold or other allergens in the air in our house. So we put it in the bedroom where she sleeps, and she's had no headaches since we set up the air filter. And air filters are also extremely effective at filtering out viruses. And a cheaper alternative that may be even better for filtering the air because it can filter a higher volume of air is what's known as a Corsi-Rosenthal box, which is basically a homemade device consisting simply of a box fan, 4 HEPA 13 furnace filters, and some cardboard for the base, as well as some duct tape to hold everything together. Now, I haven't done this yet, but I think the estimated cost appears to be around $50 US. So if you can afford to do that in your house or apartment, I'd highly recommend it, especially if you live in an apartment with a common hallway, or if you have guests or repair personnel over and you don't know for sure what their infection status is. Of course, obviously, you can also require anyone who visits your home who you don't know for sure is negative for COVID to wear a mask, or you could even make them take a COVID test before they come over. But anyway, so air filtration is a very good approach to reducing the likelihood of COVID infections. Another way of taking viruses out of the air involves the use of ultraviolet lamps, which are very effective at killing viruses. And specifically, these lamps are designed to emit light specifically in the ultraviolet C range, which is not harmful to humans the way exposure to some other wavelengths of ultraviolet light are. And it's extremely effective at killing viruses. Now that's a bit more expensive than filters, but it is an option. There's a number of other things that have been found by scientific research to be associated with severity of illness if you do get infected. Those include how healthy your diet is. Basically, you want to eat a diet that's low in processed foods, centered on unprocessed foods, and also that's plant-based. In other words, you're not eating a ton of meat or dairy or eggs. Best yet, the research suggests is to be vegan as well as whole foods plant-based. But anyway, so eating a healthy diet is one way that you can limit the severity of illness, perhaps even limit the likelihood of getting infected, but the main effect seems to be reduce severity of illness by I think about 70% less likelihood of becoming severely ill with COVID. Having a vitamin D deficiency has been found to be profoundly associated with having severe cases of COVID. So make sure you are not vitamin D deficient. Also, having at least some minimal exposure to infrared light, which mainly comes from the sun. You could also get some if you sit in front of a fireplace. At least 15 minutes a day. So, get outside during the day when the sun is shining, and you can even be bundled up in winter weather, and the infrared light will still get through to you. So that seems to be important for reducing severity of illness, as well as reduced likelihood of getting COVID in the first place. So, also, I didn't write this down when I was jotting down notes for this, but there's also been some research indicating that fever is a very typical symptom of COVID and many other infectious diseases, and it's pretty unpleasant to have, but it turns out that fever serves an important function. It helps the immune system function better. So obviously you don't want your fever to get too high because that could be very damaging. But as long as your fever is not really out of control, you're actually better off just letting yourself have a fever in order to fight COVID. Anyway, those are some ways that you can protect yourself from COVID infection and or protect yourself from severe illness if you do get infected with COVID. And you should definitely try to not get infected with COVID if you can. Because even if you're young and healthy, you never really know what can happen. It's certainly much more common for people to have severe outcomes from COVID infection if they're elderly or if they have some sort of health condition. But young and apparently healthy people certainly have had severe cases of or even died from COVID. I mentioned, all those hundreds of thousands, 200,000 kids in the U.S. Lost a parent. At most a middle-aged person. And long COVID, where symptoms resulting from inflammation or blood clots or other problems persist for months or even years, that seems to be a fairly common outcome. Actually more common than severe acute illness, even in younger people. So certainly studies suggest there's a reduced risk of long COVID with Omicron, and there's a reduced risk of long COVID if you're vaccinated, but reduced doesn't mean zero. For the stats I've seen say something like a 5% chance. So that's really pretty high. It's a lot higher than the chance of dying from COVID. So it's definitely not something you want to have. It can keep you out of work for a long time or otherwise incapacitate you. So don't take any chances with this virus. It's not something you want to get. And hopefully China will continue with its successful policies in keeping the impact of COVID to a minimum. And certainly I've given up hope on my own government, or really most every Western government, with containing COVID. But hopefully we will see light at the end of the tunnel sometime in the near future. All right, that's all I have to say for today. Stay tuned for another episode of The Bitter Pill, where we talk about bitter pills of truth that the mainstream Western media are not going to tell you about real soon. Bye now.